Hello, and welcome back to the Nioxus Learning Channel. My name is Andy. I'm a Nioxus trainer and programmer. And in this class, we're going to complete our discussion and study of the Nioxus programming language. For the past few weeks and in the past few classes, we've been looking at how to automate processes by writing formulas, blocks of code, global code, and snippets that enabled Nioxus to effectively act on our behalf. We could program instructions and tell Nioxus when those instructions were to be carried out and under what circumstances. In this class, we're going to study triggers. Now, triggers are not so much about writing code as much as they are about using the code or initiating the execution of code blocks. Triggers are another step and another feature that allow us to add a degree of sophistication and automation to our Nioxus solutions. Now, the sample database that we've created that we're using in this class is available for download at no charge at www.nioxus.com. Go to the website, log into the member portal, and membership is free, and download the template called Working with Triggers. There's no passwords, it's completely open, load it onto your system, open it up in your version of Nioxus, and follow along as we look at this powerful and easy to use way to add more oomph, more sizzle to our Nioxus databases. And with that, let's begin. Now, in this example, we're going to work with a simple database that consists of 3 tables. And let's go ahead and open up our database data model and see what we have. We have 2 families or 2 stacks of data. The invoice stack consists of a parent, the invoice table, and its single child line items. There is also a second family which has 1 member, and that is inventory. And the idea of this sample database is we create invoices, we add line items to that invoice. Line items are based on us selling items out of our inventory, and those items each have a price. So this is the basic example we're going to use as we investigate and study the use of triggers. Now, let me first show you a few triggers in action. And then let's go back and see how we made that work, and then take an even deeper dive into some creative applications of the trigger function in Nioxus. So we begin by creating a new invoice. Now, as you can see, there's no customer, there's no ship to or bill to address. This is purely a sample database for purposes of demonstrating triggers. This is by no means an operational production quality invoicing system, although such systems are available at the Nioxus website and at our website, nioxus.com. You will first notice that this invoice, whose only field is the invoice number, has already been numbered. And if I create additional additional invoices by simply clicking the plus button to create new records, each of those new records is individually and uniquely numbered. Now, I want to point out this invoice number is different than the record ID. And in this case, you can see that the record ID is the same as the invoice number, and that is purely a coincidence. Watch what happens if I create invoice number 1001. That is record with the ID 11, but now watch as I create new invoices. It picks up with the next invoice number. And if I want to skip a number and move up to invoice 2015, I can do that, and the very next invoice will pick up at 2016, 17, and 18, and so on. And here you see, while the ID numbers are sequential, the invoice numbers, each one is merely the previous number plus 1. The other thing about record numbering versus record ID, if I were to delete line 20, which is invoice number 2018, record number 20, I'm going to go ahead and delete that record. The next record I create will again be invoice number 2018. But note here that the ID of this record is record number 21. As we know, when we delete a record in Nioxus, the ID of that record is deleted, never to be reused. With invoice or document or record numbering, however, we retain the ability to reuse numbers, to assign numbers, and to sequentially code the numbers in any direction that we want to go. So, let us, now that we've seen that, I'm going to get rid of all of this data and start over. We're going to create a new record. It is invoice number 1. And I'm going to create 3 line items for that invoice. You will note the line items are also each numbered automatically 1, 2, and 3. Line number 1 is going to be for the sale of item 1001 in the quantity of 10 units. And you will note that the price per unit has already been calculated at the default of $100. Now, the line total should be quantity times price. So let's jump in here real quick and just create that formula, quantity times price. Okay. Now the reason I wanted you to see me creating that formula is a formula field. And again, these are data entry fields, a numeric field, a lookup or reference field, 2 numeric fields. Line total is a formula field. A formula field is actually a form of a trigger. When a certain series of events have been completed, the formula field goes off. It does whatever it was supposed to do. Now, the most obvious reference of a trigger is in a gun. When we pull the trigger, that initiates a sequence of events culminating in the weapon discharging its ammunition. In Nioxus, a trigger refers to the completion of a series of events that results in Nioxus returning a calculated value or returning the result of some code block that was previously defined. Now in this case, you saw me create the code block. It's a simple single line of quantity multiplied times the price per unit. And when both the quantity and the price per unit are filled in, the trigger is effectively pulled and the line total computes. Let's see this again as we go into line number 3 and select item number 3003. The price per unit defaults to 300. We'll put in a quantity of 25 units. The trigger is pulled. 25 units at $300 per unit is a line total of $7,500. Let's do this one more time and look at a different trigger. I'm going to go in and select inventory item 2002. And if you look at the far right-hand side of this selection window, you can see that this item defaults at a sale price of $200 per unit. Note that prior to my selecting any item in this inventory lookup field, price per unit is blank. When I select an item, the default price for that item is triggered into, it is put into the price per unit for this particular line item. Now, $200 is the default price for item number 2, item coded 2002. I could change that price. Let's say we're giving someone a 50% discount. I could update that to be $100, and if we sell 2 units, that's a line total of $200. But when you saw this line automatically populated, and we've got our line numbers here, our line numbers are changing. There's something wrong there. We got to figure that out. But as you see me entering line numbers, the line number is being incremented automatically. That's happening with a trigger. And when I select a piece of inventory, the price per unit is being filled in automatically. That is also happening with a trigger. And then finally, as each new invoice is created, as you'll see here in the invoice number field, the invoice document number is also being incremented by 1. And as I skip from invoice number 3 to invoice 2501, and if I were to jump ahead to invoice 4001, the next one would be 4002. All of this auto incrementing, all of this auto population of fields with default prices, it's all happening with triggers. Let's see how to do it. Now, you'll remember from a couple of classes ago when we talked about code levels. Code levels talk about where the code blocks or the code snippets are defined. At the highest level, we can define code at the database level by going into options and creating database level code. That's code that is accessed or can be accessed from anywhere in our Nioxus application. We can then step down in levels from application or database level code to table level code, field level code, record level code. The first trigger we're going to look at today is a table level code piece of programming. So to look at that, let's look at our table. I am going to go into the table edit form or the table edit window, and this is for the invoice header, the parent of the invoice stack or family of records. And I want you to note that there are two options where we can create table level code. Trigger on create, trigger after update. And obviously the trigger on create is where we have placed this code block, this trigger. Now, what happens or what needs to happen for the trigger to be pulled? What series of events need to be completed for the result to be executed or presented by Nioxus? The answer is in the name of the field. Trigger on create. The triggering event, that which initiates the series of actions, that which initiates the execution of the code that results in the assignment of the next number in sequence to this invoice, the trigger, the act, is the creation of a new record in this table. Trigger on create. Any code here is going to be executed every time the user indicates that a new record is to be created in this table. That is table level code, and that is a creation trigger, or that is an event triggered by the creation of a record. Let's go in and look at the code itself. And what we see here is that we are establishing the existence of a variable named I. We are then selecting the invoice number field out of an invoice record in the invoices table. It is a very specific record. It is the last record. The logic here is the last record entered into the database would have the highest number invoice. We would start with invoice 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7. Now, if the last invoice entered was number 7, that is the highest invoice number to date. And in line 2, we see that number being incremented by 1. So if the last record in the invoice table contains the number X or the number 10 in that record's invoice number field, then this new invoice that we are creating is going to contain that value plus 1, which will give us invoice number 11. Now there's some things we have to be very careful of when we use this type of code block, but we'll get to those in a moment. Let's just focus on what we have right now. We are designating a variable. We are assigning that variable the number of the invoice that was the last invoice created in the table. And we are saying this new invoice, whenever it's created, whenever the trigger gets pulled and a new invoice is being created, give that invoice the number of the last invoice plus 1. So let's go back and look at our table. The last invoice created, which is on line 9, record number 30, is invoice number 4002. When I click this button, this plus button, I am effectively pulling the trigger. I am telling Nioxus to do the thing that would cause that block of code to be executed. And that thing is create a new record in the invoices table. Let's pull the trigger. The trigger is pulled, and sure enough, the last record, as we see here, was 4002. This new record is 4003, the number of the previous record plus 1. If I create 5 more records by clicking the Create Record button, I'm pulling the trigger 5 more times, which will result in invoices number 4004, 5, 6, 7, and 8 being created. The system will automatically insert into the invoice number field a value equal to the number of the most recently entered invoice plus 1. And it will do that when the trigger is pulled. Now, we have to be very, very careful when using this type of code for this reason. As you can see, the records are being created sequentially as I click through the system. However, Nioxus has been instructed to look at only the last record in the table. What if, for whatever reason, this invoice was actually invoice number 5412? It is not the last record that was created. It is third from the last record created. Since this invoice on line 18, which has the ID number 39, since the time this invoice 5412, was created, 2 more invoices have been created. Now, if we are actually staying in sequence, the next invoice number should be 5413, the highest number of the number of the highest numbered invoice in the table plus 1. But in this case, since Nioxus is only looking at the last record, it's going to create 4014 because the last record was 4013. To get around this problem, we are going to go into administrative mode, go into the table management window, and replace the number of the last record with the maximum, the highest number in the entire table, irrespective of what record it is. Now, when we look at this table, we see these records are being listed in sequence. And according to this sequence, and I will put them in sequence ascending order by record ID number, the number of the last invoice created is 4014. But the number of the invoice with the highest invoice number was created 3 records prior to that, and that invoice is numbered 5412. By modifying the code to look not at simply the last record, but the entire table, identifying in that table which invoice has the highest number, that will now give us invoice 5413, which is the highest numbered invoice plus 1. And that's really the way that should work. So what have we learned so far? We have learned that we can create a trigger at the table level that automatically executes every time a new record is created in that table. And there's a lot of things we can do with the trigger on create. But in this example, what we're doing is we're establishing the document number, not the record number, the document number for this invoice. This can be used for purchase orders, shipping notices, time cards, any document in your business that is sequentially numbered and you want it to be automatically numbered. Triggers will get the job done. A table level trigger in the trigger on create is the level. That's where you want the code to be. And this code, this very simple block of code, where we go back and say, all right, what is the number of the highest numbered document in the table? And then add 1 to it. It's those 2 simple lines of code that will instruct Nioxus and enable us to have a sequentially numbered series of documents. Unlike the record ID, however, we can control how the sequence is established. Let me tell you what I mean. There are some reasons why you might want your documents to be numbered sequentially, but not necessarily in steps of 1. For example, some organizations number their customer invoices using even numbers and their accounts payable invoices, or the invoices they have to pay, with odd numbers. So invoices that we send our customers that cause them to send money to us, those would be even numbered documents. And invoices that we receive from our vendors that we have to pay would be odd numbered documents. And this makes it very easy, based simply on the document number, to know if it's going to drive a cash receipt or a cash disbursement. Even numbered documents are customer invoices. Those are going to drive a cash receipt, customers paying us. Where the odd numbered documents are invoices we have to pay, that's a cash disbursement, us sending money to our vendors. Because we can control not only the document number, but the document numbering steps, we can do things like this. I'm going to create a new document, and I'm going to go into the code, not the field level code, the table level code, and I'm going to make one very simple change. Instead of incrementing by 1, increment by 2. Now, I'm going to very quickly do a couple of things. First, I'm going to get rid of, by selecting all and deleting my selection, all of the records in this invoice table. Then, for purposes of this demonstration, I am going to duplicate the invoices table by first renaming it customer invoices or accounts receivable invoices. I will save that name, go back in, and duplicate the table, duplicating all lines in the table. And this new table will be called Vendor Invoice AP, Accounts Payable. Now, to demonstrate this numbering sequence trick that some organizations use, both of these tables have a trigger. And the that one's missing. Here's a beautiful thing about triggers. It's very easy to copy and paste. When you duplicate a table, you are duplicating the data model of the table, the fields and the elements and the structure of the table. You can even duplicate the content of the table. But when you duplicate a table, the triggers for each table do not get duplicated. You must manually copy them. So I'll go back to the original table, go in, grab all of this code, and copy it. And I will now go into my newly created vendor invoice table, go into Trigger on Create, and paste it. Just need to make a couple of quick changes. Now, since we're in the vendor invoice table, the next vendor invoice or accounts payable invoice is not going to be based on the highest numbered document in the customer invoice AR table. It's going to be the highest numbered document in the vendor invoice AP table. Everything else stays the same. One more thing and we're ready to go. I'm going to create a default invoice in the vendor AP table called Invoice 1. And we're ready to go. Watch what happens. Now, all of my customer invoices, my accounts receivable invoices, are going to have even numbers. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, all the way through 22. And all of my vendor invoices will have odd numbers. 1, 3, 5, 7, all the way forever. This way, by changing the step mechanism, ordering it in steps of 2, we can skip a number. If you're building a general ledger chart of accounts, you might want each account to have an account number that is separated by 10 digits from the previous one. This gives us room to insert accounts later on into our general ledger financial system. By doing that, we would just go in, select the record with the highest account number so far, and then make our next account number that number plus 10. So this is a very handy little block of code that allows us to do a lot of things and have a lot of control that the record ID does not necessarily give us. Now I want to go into another piece of code, specifically another piece of table level code with a table level trigger, but we're going to do something a little bit different with this one. I want you to note that we have created invoice number 24. I know it's an accounts receivable invoice, not only because it tells me so in the field name, in the table name, but because it's an even numbered invoice, and I know that all even numbered invoices are always receivable or cash incoming, cash receipt documents. Watch what happens with my line items. As I would expect, as I create a line item, it is sequentially numbered. I pulled the trigger 6 times. 6 line items were created for invoice number 24. The highest one is line item number 6. If I go in, which at some point I most certainly would, and create another invoice, that invoice is also going to have line items, but we don't want to pick up with the highest numbered line item in the table. Right now, that's record number, line item number 6. That was for a different invoice. Every invoice has to start over with invoice line number 1, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of things that have to happen a little differently in this in this table level trigger. Let's look at what they are. Let's open up the child table, the line items table management window. Well, now what's happened here? There is no code for trigger on create. The code is in trigger after update. This solves one problem, but could potentially create a new problem. Let's first talk about the problem that it solves. In Nioxus, when you are creating a child record from inside the parent, the trigger to affect the numbering or any automatic population of fields in the child table record, that code, that trigger must be in the update trigger. Trigger on create only works when I, the user, am creating the record at the parent level. Once I'm inside this family, I'm inside this stack. This is the parent record. When I click this plus sign over here to create a child record, even though I am clicking the button, Nioxus is creating the record. The Nioxus parent, in this case invoice number 28, is creating the line item child for that family. And records created by Nioxus, records created in child tables from within the parent, trigger on create, no code in that field will execute. Therefore, the code to automatically number child records, that code must be in the trigger after update. And that's just the way it is. A common mistake is for people to put their trigger on create into the parent record. It works perfectly well. Then they go into the child record, they put it in the exact same place, and it stops working. That is because records created in a child table from inside a parent, the trigger must be on or after update. Now, in this particular instance, we want to sequentially number the line items of each invoice. So if an invoice has 5 line items, we want them numbered sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But then if we go to create the next invoice, the first line item of the next invoice should start at 1 again. It shouldn't pick up at 6. It should start at 1 and advance onward from there. So we need to have an extra line of code in this trigger after update. The first line of code is the one that we're used to seeing. We are initiating a variable, in this case called invoice number, or the abbreviation INV capital NO, and we are assigning the value of the invoice that is the parent to this variable. The next line establishes the existence of a variable named X. And we are selecting all line items all records in the line items table that are associated with this current invoice. And for all of those records, we are looking at the line number field and selecting the last one. We could have just as easily done this by looking at all of them and picking out the maximum, the highest numbered record. And then finally, we are assigning the line number of our newly created record, the value of X as a number, plus 1. So let's look at this code and step through how it would work. I create a new invoice. Let's call it invoice number 100. The variable INV capital NO will be assigned the value for the invoice 100, the record for the invoice number 100. In the next line, the variable X will be initialized, and it will contain an array. Remember when we talked about selecting records? A selection or a subset of records in a table is called an array. This subset in the line items table consists of only those line items where it is a line item of this current invoice, invoice 100. And that's stipulated here, where the invoice reference field in the child table is pointing to the invoice that we are currently looking at, as designated by this variable here, INV capital NO. So go into the line items table, pull out a subset or select an array of records where the criteria to be included in the array is you are a child, a line item of this current invoice. For all of the records that qualify to be in that subset or array, look at the line number field, get the maximum number in that field, and make that plus 1 the number of this newly created line. So I created invoice 100. Let's say invoice 100 already has 5 line items. The highest numbered line number for this invoice is 5. So the next line item for this invoice will be 5 plus 1, or 6. Now I've completed that invoice, and I go off and create invoice 101, the next invoice. I create the first line item for invoice 101. Before it is numbered, Nioxus will go into the line items table and create an array, a subset of records consisting of all line items, all records in the table that are children of this current invoice, invoice number 101. It won't find any, which means the maximum will be 0, and 0 plus 1 is 1. So the first line number of every new invoice will start by being line number 1. The second invoice will be 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on. So this function here, this selecting or finding the highest number of the numbered children of this parent, ensures that the line item counting or the child record numbering always starts over at 1. So it solves that problem of the first invoice line item for invoice 102 being the highest numbered invoice plus 1, the highest numbered line item from the previous invoice plus 1. It solves that problem, but at the same time, it has created another. Watch what happens. Remember, this trigger is after update. A record is only created once, so a trigger on create will only be executed one time. Once a record is created, it can be changed, it can be duplicated, it can be deleted, it can be updated and modified, but it can't be created again. You only are created one time. You can be updated or modified an infinite number of times. Modifications or triggers after update say, every time a change is made to this record, execute this code. Well, that's a bit of a problem, and I'll show you why. If I go in, this is line number 1, specifically for invoice number 28. If I go into line number 1 and I select an inventory item, I just changed the record. Now it's line item number 2. If I enter the quantity, let's say we're buying or selling 10 of this item, that's another update. Now this line item is line number 3. What is happening is it is correctly starting the line numbering schematic or the line numbering sequence at 1, but because we have to use a trigger after update, it's renumbering that same line number every time we make a change to the record. That's a problem. Let's solve the problem. All we need is 2 very simple lines of code. The first line, which will be our new line 1, is going to say if the line number field, that is the line number of the newly created child or line item record, if it is equal to null, if it contains nothing, then do these 3 things. Line 2, find out what our current invoice is. Line 3, find the highest numbered line item for that invoice. And line 4, make this new invoice number, this new line item number equal to the previously highest plus 1. And the other line I need to add is an end to the if structure. There is no else. What have we done? We have specified that this block of code is only to be executed, only to be triggered when the line number field is blank, when it contains no value. Let's see the effect of this if-then statement. Let's delete this invoice, create a new one, in this case invoice number 30. Let's create a few line items, in this case 4. Now I'm going to go into line item number 1, select an inventory item, put in a quantity, update the price. I selected an inventory item, that was update number 1, put in a quantity, that was update number 2, and changed the price per unit, that was update number 3. But in spite of all of those updates, this is still invoice line item number 1. Because once it was assigned a value, this field was no longer null. And since the trigger can only be executed, or since the process of numbering the line items can only happen when it has not already happened, it can only happen when the field is null or empty, it won't overwrite the line numbers. So again, let's go back and remember what we've learned. When auto-numbering the documents or the records in the parent table, trigger on create. When auto-numbering the line items of the parent or the records in the child table, trigger after update. And since it is after an update, we want to enclose the block of code that does the auto-numbering inside of an if-then loop where the condition to be executed is the line number field is blank. It has not previously been numbered. So there we have it. Now let me show you a nice trick you can use in line number display. And this is not really so much about triggers, but as long as I'm here, I want to share this with you. When displaying the line numbers for any parent document, whether it's an invoice for a receivable, a vendor invoice, a purchase order, a shipping notice, any parent document that is subdivided into many line items, when you are displaying those line item child record numbers, do it like this. Instead of actually pulling the line number field from the child table, let's hide that, use a formula. Do a little concatenation where the line number displayed will be the invoice number, but we have to specify this to be in text format. A delimiter, which in this case will be a period, and then drop in the line number of the child record. And the nice thing about this is, oh yeah, and don't forget to name this formula line number. Now what we have is our line numbers are a subset of the parent document record. Here we have all of the line numbers of document number 28, and they are line numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, demonstrated as 28.1, 28.2, so on and so forth. The line numbers for document number 30, again, are designated as such. So in using this little concatenation trick, we can embed the parent number, any delimiter. In this case, I've used a period. It could be a dash, a slash, parentheses, braces, anything you want. It's just a little trick that we use to better associate child records with automatically sequence numbered parent records. Let's look at one more trigger before we wrap it up for the day. We now know how to number the records themselves, and we did that with table level code. Let's look at one more trigger that exists at the field level. Remember, the highest level is database level code, then table level code, then field level code. Let's look at a field level trigger, and that is right here. Note that when I select an inventory item and see that my price per unit is 0, once I select an item, it automatically puts the default sale price for that item into the price per unit field of the line item for this sale invoice. If I select a different item and change my mind, I'm not selling item 1, I'm selling item 3, it updates the number automatically. This is a field level trigger, so let's go look at the field. In the inventory field, we have created a trigger after update. Now you will notice there's only one trigger option at the field level. At the table level, there were 2 trigger options: trigger on create, trigger after update. At the field level, only one option: trigger after update. And the trigger is very simple. Go in and look up in the inventory file the sale price of the item we selected. And here we see the reference from the line item table out to the inventory table. I drill into the inventory lookup table and I get the sale price. And then assign whatever that number is to the field price per unit for this particular line item. That's all we need. The trigger will be executed every time I change the value of this field. Let's see it in action. I'll exit administrative mode, create a new line item, in this case, line number 5 for invoice number 28. Select the inventory item, in this case, item number 2. Item number 2 has a default selling price of $200. And sure enough, that's the default price for this line item. If you want to make things even a little bit fancier, go in and set the quantity to always be a minimum of 1 or 0.1 or 0.01, whatever the smallest number of units of measure that you sell. So this way, my line items will work like this. I've just created a new line number. It's line number 6. I go in, select an inventory item. Well, that should have defaulted to 1. Oh, I put my default in the wrong field. It's not a minimum value. It is the default value of 1. So let's try that again. Sorry about that. Create a new line item. Sure enough, quantity is defaulting to 1. Now we're up to line number 7. Pick my inventory item, item number 2, defaults to 200. 1 times 200 is, of course, 200. Update the quantity, and the number of my line total goes up accordingly. I can still zoom in on my inventory item and see what we've got. I can change the default. Let's say I'm giving them a 10% discount and selling it not for 200, but for 180 per unit. The 200 was the default based on the established recommended selling price for the item. But once the default is there, I can change it to be whatever I want. And there we go. We now have seen 3 triggers in action. A trigger at the table level for on creation. Trigger on create, automatically number the parent record to be 1 digit, or in this case, we're stepping by 2, so 2 digits higher than the highest number record that already exists in the table. When creating children or line items of this parent, sequentially number them starting at 1. Again, this time, however, stepping by 1, so it's not going 1, 3, 5, 7 or 2, 4, 6, 8. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 because the increment is in steps of 1. But base the starting number on line items that already exist. Do this in the trigger after update. This ensures that records created by the parent record will be automatically numbered, and they will start over with the number 1 with every new parent. So we've seen trigger on create, trigger after update, and then finally we saw a record or field level trigger here in our inventory field. This is a field that is a reference from line items to inventory. And when we change the value in this reference field, when we make an update, we are pulling the trigger. And what happens when we pull the trigger? We force Nioxus to look up the default price of the item we have selected, excuse me, and make that the sale price per unit for the item we are selling in this particular invoice line item. We can update the default price if we want, or leave it as is to speed up our data entry process. And that is how we can use triggers, not only to have Nioxus do what we need and want it to do, but to specify to Nioxus when to do these things. Now, in previous classes, we were able to affect the timing of the execution of a block of code using loops and repetitive structures, if then, while do, for next, and the case switch. And we already were using triggers without even knowing it, because a formula field is a kind of a trigger. The field itself is the trigger, and the trigger is when all of the operations and operands of whatever formula exists in this field are available, execute the formula. But now we see a new twist, a variation of timing and triggers. We can trigger the timing of the execution of a block of code to be when a record is created, or every time a record is updated, or when a specific field in a record is updated for the first time, or if it gets updated anytime. So now we have an even tighter, more granular, more nuanced level of control over what Nioxus does, when it does it, and what conditions have to be in place for a trigger to be pulled. That's how we work with triggers. This is just a few examples of the literally hundreds of ways we can apply the trigger technology or the trigger function in Nioxus. This is a very common way to apply triggers by auto-numbering documents, auto-sequencing the child records of those documents, but let your imagination run wild. That does it for this class, and this is the last class in this 400 series level of training classes in the Nioxus Learning Series that deal with Nioxus code. Our next class is the beginning of the 500 level series of classes, and those classes talk about viewing data, creating dashboards, creating views, Kanbans, charts, graphs, and print formats. How do we create the layout of reports that are going to come out of Nioxus, either in PDF form or hard copy as they come off a printer or production device? That's what we're going to be talking about in the next class in the Nioxus Learning Series, and that is class 500.01. That's the end of this class, working with triggers, and I want to thank you for joining me. If you are following along, I hope you practiced, and I hope you will continue to use triggers as you build out your Nioxus databases and custom applications. I hope you had fun and learned a lot during this class. I hope to see you in our next class, working with views, and I want to thank you for joining us here at the Nioxus Learning Channel. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.